There are 5 critical attributes of a new product. It's the schedule, the feature set, product cost, capital equipment cost, and engineering cost. Manage all those, and you should be successful in developing new products.
Welcome back to the Industrial Growth Institute podcast. When we talk about growth, we cover a broad continuum of activities. On the one hand, there's strategy and board governance and high-level conceptual stuff. On the other hand, there's very granular and tactical execution, like maybe even what does a coaching call sound like for just the first few seconds of a cold call in order to help salespeople succeed. But of course, most stuff falls somewhere in between on that continuum. And today's topic is a really interesting example. Today, we're talking about using new product innovation as an input for growth. So in other words, we can sell more of what we do or make to existing customers. We can sell what we do or make to new customers, or we can create or acquire new things to sell either to existing or to new customers, maybe even penetrate new markets. So that could increase penetration of existing customers. It could get us into new markets. It could get us into new industries and geographies. So it's a really interesting angle. It can also potentially help reduce concentration risk. So it's an interesting topic to talk about. And to say that we have an expert to guide us through this would be an understatement. Eric is the president of Pinnacle Product Innovation. He's a product innovation and management consultant who provides entrepreneurs and established companies the expertise to move new products from the opportunity to the market reality. He has 35 years plus of on the ground actual experience in product innovation, product development, manufacturing, commercialization, and project management. And he's worked in the consumer and medical and industrial product industries with companies ranging across a wide variety of sizes from startup through Fortune 500. So he's done what we're going to be talking about. His areas of expertise include business growth through new product innovation, new product strategy, project management, and product innovation education. So not only does he do it, but he spends a lot of time helping others. And he brings extensive academic credentials to his work with an MBA from Pepperdine and bachelor's in engineering and applied sciences from Arizona State, and also lots of practical implementation with a number of patents and industry leadership in the Product Development and Management Association, PDMA. There's a mouthful. I'd never heard of it before, from which he holds the New Product Development Professional Certification. And he's also active in the Society of Plastics Engineers. So that's a lot about Eric. We're going to likely bounce around a lot today from theory to execution and back. There's certainly going to be a lot to prompt some comments. Be sure to drop them in on your favorite platform and I'll respond to them. And please subscribe while you're there. So with that, let's rock and welcome Eric.
My pleasure to be here, Ed.
Thanks so much for spending some time with me and the audience of the Industrial Growth Institute podcast. So obviously you're a product development expert, but before we go there, first, you're also a person living in Southern California right now in the midst of fires. What's it like on the ground there?
It's challenging. Close friends of mine have lost their homes.
Wow.
I had some of my belongings at one of my friends' homes, and unfortunately those are gone. So we are in the midst of rebuilding, and it's going to be a journey.
Are things under control at this point? I mean, it looks like there's new things that are popping up, particularly down in San Diego.
I saw that this morning, yes, for the most part. But it will be a new way of life, certainly in Southern California.
Wow. All right, shifting gears, not to diminish the importance of that, but we're here to talk about innovation. And so I want to kind of get initially to the core of the issue. During one of our early conversations, you used the term market anguish. And let's start there. I mean, not only is that an evocative term, but I sense it probably also underlies most everything that you do. So tell me what that means and kind of how you develop that term in that sense.
Sure. people out in the market using products, whether they're consumer and industrial or medical, whatever it might be, often they're frustrated with some type of lack of performance in a product, and they have a pain. They have multiple pains. Maybe the product doesn't do exactly what they want it to do. Maybe it isn't working fast enough. It isn't affordable. And so they're trying to make do with some hacks, if you will, until they can find a product that really does what they want it to do in an affordable way.
But how
And
often are
that's
they
the
actually
angle.
looking? I mean, my sense is most cases people just resign themselves to the fact that this sucks, but it's just the way of the world.
There is often that. You are correct. Um, they I've worked a lot in the dental industry, for example. They're pretty good at hacking things together, and so they're making something work. But yeah, so they may be looking, but don't know where to look, don't know how to look. I was working with an entrepreneur who thought in the medical industry, he thought there was a anguish. He had an anguish, but he didn't know where to look. And ultimately, through our market research to determine if there was a new product, there was a product out there. It was difficult to find, to your point, but ultimately, there was a product out there that met his needs, overcame his anguish.
All right, so market research. I assume that's the lever by which you find this anguish.
Typically, yes.
And is that qualitative or quantitative? How do you go about doing it?
Well, we'll do both. Normally, I prefer the qualitative work. I've got a market research assistant. We will look at the world out there as we know it through secondary research, internet, industry reports, etc. And then, when necessary, we'll go in and do primary research. We've interviewed, for example, durable medical equipment dealers to understand what kind of anguish they're having in a particular product category. So that's an example of the research that we do to figure out, is there anguish in the market where there's a new product that can be delivered?
But that
Normally, we're doing that for a client.
so you raise an interesting point with that last example and something we're going to come back to. I tend to think of the research that you would do around the end user. You talked about
Both.
doing research around the dealer, and so sometimes the new product can represent a benefit for the end users as well as for channel partners, it sounds like.
Right. So I call them, in totality, I call them stakeholders.
Okay.
The stakeholders can be the end user. It could be a gatekeeper who, let's say, in a hospital has a purchasing authority or in any other organization. It could be a distributor, could be the manufacturer. All of these folks are potential stakeholders in what ultimately will be that path between the product opportunity and the product that gets delivered into the market.
So you're not necessarily looking to improve the experience for them. You're looking to tap their expertise from their perspective as a stakeholder.
Both.
Got it. So thinking about qualitative research, it can probably feel like a daunting task to the typical listener here. I mean, our audience is industrial manufacturers, lower to middle market, say 25 to 300 million, not necessarily a multinational CPG that, runs focus groups and has a big budget for market research. Is this kind of research feasible for a company of that type?
Sure. So I'll give you an example. I worked with a Southern California industrial products company. They made everything from force sensing resistors to infrared and radio frequency remote controls for digital projectors. But they wanted to grow. They weren't sure where to grow. And they realized that people have a remote control in their hand. Who are those folks? So they brought me in to take a look at what opportunities for new product innovation and sales growth accordingly they could have. I identified a trade group called the National Speakers Association, made some connections with them, created an advisory panel, very low cost. And then ultimately, I got invited to their trade show where I pulled together a focus group. It was sponsoring one of their events. It was, again, relatively inexpensive. Sat in a room for a little over an hour, just soliciting ideas, understanding their anguish in being professional speakers, teachers, trainers, whatever it was that they were on stage with a remote control in their hand, identified what kind of new products could make their business more productive, more successful, and we ended up with an ultra portable public address system that could fold up like a laptop, fit in the overhead compartment of an airplane, and come with a little wireless mic, sell for under $1,000. About 80% of the people in the room said they'd pay $1,000 for it tomorrow. That project, it was about a $35,000 initial expense, not including my time, and generated over millions of dollars of revenue over the 14 plus years it's been in market today.
So that was the work you did with Interlink Electronics, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, I think we'll circle back to talk about that a little bit further in a little while. But what's interesting is that in that situation that you're describing, nobody was jumping up and down saying we need a portable PA system. It was that discussion, that qualitative research, that focus group that allowed you to understand what the limitations were in their existing model to visualize that that was an opportunity.
That's a fair statement. Most of the anguish I probed for during the focus group, they knew they had a problem. They didn't know how to articulate it or what to do about it, or, as to your earlier point, where to go to solve that problem. Sometimes people in the market, the stakeholders, they know there's a problem, and sometimes they don't. Apple's very good at understanding where end users don't know they have a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I like the term anguish. I think angst is another interesting way to talk about it, where people just have this gut feeling that something's not quite right, and they don't identify it as a problem, again, because that's the way it's always been. But there's something that rattles around in their head saying, geez, I wish there was a better way, even if they're not thinking about it consciously.
Right. That happens.
So experience tells me that the better we understand you and your background, the better we can understand your work and how you arrived at it and why you do it. So let's wind back a few years. I mean, in high school, you were very clear that you were interested in industrial technology and bending metal and manufacturing, and you were an entrepreneur as a young person. So this has been in your blood since you were a kid.
Yes. Yeah, I grew up in the Rust Belt of Cleveland, Ohio. I was one of the top machinists in my high school graduating class. I operated a electro discharge machine, an EDM machine, when I was 16. It was quite the experience. And that gave me the sense that there was something more I should be doing in that space, and ultimately ended up in engineering school.
And then after engineering school, you did something that's opaque from your LinkedIn for about 7 years until you went to work at Sunrise. Were you in the Peace Corps, or were you experimenting as flipping burgers? What were you doing at that point?
So I don't put everything all the way back, because then you'll know how old I am exactly. I started with American Hospital Supply right out of college, designing, developing, being overseeing, if you will, a start-off project manager in the medical device industry in Southern California. So that was quite the experience. Spent a ton of time in plastic product development, so I know that very well. And then moved on to a company called Everest and Jennings. At the time, they were the world's largest manufacturer of wheelchairs. They had 500,000 square feet under one roof.
Wow.
In Southern California, one of the largest chrome plating facilities in the US at the time. And then left there and spent some time in the furniture industry. Came back then to the durable medical equipment industry at Sunrise Medical. And I think that's where my LinkedIn picks up.
Got it. Now, my suspicion, obviously, those were great development experiences, but I think that you probably got a much sharper focus after your time at Mattel. You were selected as one of a dozen people in this cross-functional skunk works. Who knew that toys were so complicated? I mean, that must have been a really cool position and initiative. Tell us a little bit about that and help us understand whether that really was as formative as I suspect it might have been in your direction?
Sure. Well, it was nice because there were synergies between the X Team project, which is the Skunk Works, my position working for the chief strategy officer of Mattel, And at the time, I was getting my MBA. So having all of that going on at one time, and I was pulled into this skunkworks team, the X team. There was about a dozen of us from across the corporation. It had never been done before. We went off site for 6 weeks.
Wow.
Our charter was to look at the way Mattel was developing new products and figure out perhaps how they could be more entrepreneurial to be able to move from opportunities in the market, understanding the stakeholders, and ultimately expediting new products in the market.
Mm-hmm.
It was quite an experience.
And was it the source of lessons that you brought forward in your career, or was it just kind of beginning a different way of thinking about things?
It was a wide variety of learnings. Getting outside of the major, I would call the vortex of what can go on at a major corporation,
Right.
and thinking differently and being able to be in this R&D environment that wasn't worried about, we got a problem on the production line. Let's pull all the engineers off of the R&D projects,
Right.
put them into putting the fire out now, and then maybe we'll get them back in, or maybe we lose it to an engineer or two to the factory.
Right.
And then forsaking your future as a company because you're worried about what's going on day to day.
Sure.
So that was a quite of a learning, and then learning to look outside the box. We did a lot of observational research. We worked with children at elementary schools. We went to shopping malls and observed young adults. Particularly, we were looking at this idea that the Barbie franchise was losing end users at a younger and younger age. We were trying to figure out, what are they doing?
Mm-hmm.
So that was quite an experience to just think differently, look differently. And I suspect that did carry over ultimately into the Interlink Electronics, where I took a company that had no idea there could be an adjacent market category, such as a portable PA,
Right.
where they didn't have that tech, but there was a market opportunity. And then how do you execute against it? So that Skunkworks project, the X team at Mattel, allowed me to look and think differently for market opportunities.
And it sounds similar. I'm ignorant. I'm an outsider. I don't know about the way this stuff happens, but it sounds similar to the stories I hear about P&G, where they send researchers into people's homes and just watch them go about doing laundry and cleaning the kitchen and cleaning the bathroom and that sort of thing, and envision from that observation new products.
Yes, it's typically called ethnographic research, observational, if you will, research. And I remember when I was working at Mattel on the Intel Play brand product line, a new brand for Intel with this co-venture. And they spoke about how they did this ethnographic, this observational research in Europe, and how important it was to their core business of making computer chips, because in Europe, homes were so much smaller, and they might have a central workstation in the home where a single computer was shared by the family, and they would have never understood that if they stayed in their silo in the US and not looked differently and did this observational research.
You know, one of the kind of fundamental mindsets of many industrial sales organizations is that their salespeople look for active projects. Sometimes they get called about it. Sometimes they prospect and someone says, "Oh yeah, we're working on that. You called it a good time. We'll get a quote from you." I believe very strongly that an alternative mindset that's really important is to just be determined you're going to get a certain number of factory visits per week where you get on the floor and you walk through. And if you have enough business acumen and enough experience, you'll see something and you'll say, geez, help me understand, why are they doing it that way? How did you develop that? Or is there anything you wish you could improve about that? What's
Yes,
the bottleneck around it? And it's probably an analog to the ethnographic research that you're describing.
absolutely. And I've spent many, many years in factories all over the world. I've been from South America to Asia, up into Canada. So I see things in factories that are the same thing, just
Right.
walking around. Why are you doing it this way? I worked with a company in Southern California that had sales quadruple overnight. It was a COVID related product. And they were like the Keystone Cops bumping into each other, and they needed the opportunity to have some fresh eyes to see those
Right.
inefficiencies.
Right.
And so that was a great opportunity for me to help them scale up.
Now, one of the things that jumped out at me about your career is that you've kind of had a series of 4 to 5 year stops. Is that the length of time that it takes to breathe life into the culture, do the research, create new products, and launch them successfully, or is that just pure coincidence?
A little bit of all the above, and
Okay.
I tend to get bored after about that period of time. I think the shortest stint I did was a year. The longest was about 8 years. But on average, yes, around 4 years. And then I think I've made the most amount of contributions to a company's growth after that.
Mm-hmm.
And they've created this new plateau. And that's probably about as far as they're going to go
Right.
for most organizations. And then I realize it's time for me to apply my expertise elsewhere.
Got it. What percent of revenue would you say a traditional industrial manufacturing firm should expect to create on an annual basis from products that maybe they've introduced over just the last couple of years?
I've seen where there's all kinds of statistics, maybe as low as 10%, but certainly some go up above 30%. It requires a sustained R&D effort.
That's part of
Most
the philosophy, I think, at 3M, right? I mean, haven't they identified, I forget what the number is, but some significant percentage of all sales will be products that didn't exist 3 years ago, I think.
3M, Procter and Gamble, there are a number of companies. When I was at the working with the Interlink Electronics company, we looked at what was their R&D expense as a percent of sales. And with public companies in their space, how does that compare? And at the time, they were pretty low, but it made sense because primarily they had been an OEM company. And moving from an OEM company to a product branded in the market company required a higher level of R&D investment.
Mm-hmm. Um, I mean, that's a kind of an interesting question then about the way you plan and forecast the finances of it. I mean, I think as I talk to many industrial manufacturers, their idea of innovation is maybe a new HMI or a new servo controller on a fairly well established and traditional machine. And so it's easy from a kind of a forecasting perspective to say, oh, yeah, we're innovating, but anticipate essentially a linear sort of growth from those existing products. I sense that you're talking about really radically new products, completely different products. Is that fair?
Yes, again, yes, and I think of it as managing a portfolio of investments.
Okay.
You want some investments that maybe don't quite have the high level of return, but they're less risk.
Right.
And yet you want some in your portfolio that have a higher level of risk, but have a potential for a much higher return.
So
Some
moonshots.
people, yes, some people use the term singles, doubles, triples, home runs.
Right.
Uh, it would be difficult for a, let's say, $50 million a year company to have all home run projects in the portfolio because they can't afford that.
Sure.
And it doesn't make sense. But some incremental programs, let's call them B's and C's, in the portfolio, maybe that's 60% of the portfolio of new products.
Mm-hmm.
But having more A's and high level B's is an opportunity to jumpstart, reach a new level of revenue. And with the Interlink Electronics company, the R&D was done outside through a strategic partner that I found, developed, had the relationship with,
I see.
and they delivered finished goods to the warehouse without any manufacturing requirements on the on Interlink
Really
themselves.
interesting. So, what's a reasonable pace of innovation? Understanding that you can outsource some of the thinking, some of the manufacturing, given that if essentially what the company has to do is know their customers really well in order to do the qualitative and ethnographic and comparable industrial research to identify the requirement, then how many new products is it reasonable for a typical manufacturer to introduce, say, every 5 years?
Well, that's a multivariate equation.
Okay.
Um, how's their sales force? Uh, what's their distribution network? Is it domestic? Is it international? Do they have distribution partners that don't require, or could they establish distribution partners that don't require a whole new sales force with new sales training and new collateral materials and all of that?
Mm-hmm.
So there are so many factors that go into that. Again, using the Interlink as an example, the best new product that came out of the research was deemed as best in part because it used the exact same dealer network and the exact same sales force.
Got it. How do you see business model innovation, whether it's subscriptions, recurring revenue, that kind of thing, as tying in with the product innovation? Are they separate, or should we try to associate them, or do they interlock sometimes and not others?
It depends on the organization structure. So certainly, one of the models I'm seeing more and more is a post-market sales and service. So the question is the company who's offering the product prepared to handle post-sale support, whether that's service, maintenance, preventive maintenance, whatever it might be? Or can they have a strategic partnership with a third party and be provided with a source of revenue that comes back from that third party based upon this agreement that the products that the corporation sells will be serviced by this other party, but there's revenue coming back.
Mm-hmm.
So there's lots of different ways to do it. I do see diverse business models are with multiple streams of revenue are typically looked at better when there's outside investors.
Sure, of course, it tends to boost the valuation of the multiple. Increasingly, I think there's opportunities for IIoT.
Oh, yes.
To take industrial products and connect them and help people get more audit information out of them and all kinds of other related things like that.
I was working with one investor. He talked about there wasn't going to be a deal with him and his firm unless it included hardware, software, and a data play where the data could be monetized.
Right. All right, let's talk about an interesting industrial specific innovation project that you led. You were the director of research and innovation for a company making workplace safety devices. Take us through that journey.
Sure. From 2007 through 2011, I was the R&D director for a company called Moldex Metric. Moldex is one of the most highly regarded, privately held industrial products, safety products companies. And those products include N95 masks, full face respirators, earplugs, earmuffs, a wide variety. Now they offer safety glasses in that PPE space. And back then, that was before coronavirus, before most people could spell PPE. When I walked in the door, they had a project that was being worked on, a full face respirator. And I came in and looked at what was going on, what was the market data, the stakeholder data, what was the resource allocation, what was the portfolio of projects through the R&D project team entirety, as well as the product management staffing at the company, made some recommendations for opportunities for improvement, and ultimately drove that new product, the full face respirator, a product that they had never been in before, which opened up an entirely new line of revenue with the same dealer network and same sales force.
Right.
Over a period of years, it took many years to get that from where it was when I walked in to ultimately being, let's see, this was 2011 in Dusseldorf at the Safety Products Show. it was deemed to be the number one new product in the respiratory category. And at the time, it beat all other competitors, including 3M and Honeywell and
Well,
all the big folk, as the most innovative new product.
and what was the anguish underlying that initiative?
There were several. A full face respirator, which includes the large lens and cartridges for filtration, often is worn by industrial workers for their full shift,
Mm-hmm.
8 hours, even though they may have some breaks. But it can be very heavy. And many of the products that were in the market had a big metal clamp with screws holding the lens into the rubber flange, much like you'd find in the old-fashioned gas masks.
Right.
So the fundamental premise was that if you could take a lens and put it into a molding machine and be able to mold over the lens the flange with absolute integrity and have a lighter weight, and oh, by the way, lower cost, lower labor, in this product, you'd have a win-win. It would be lighter weight, lower cost, and some of the attributes were easy to use compared to the competition. It became a very successful product and won the award and opened up a new category of revenue for the company.
Got it. One of the outcomes was that it was preferred not just by the end users, but by the channel partners as well.
Yes.
Was that improvement for channel partners part of the design process, or was it just a happy byproduct?
Well, no, channel partners were part of the research.
Okay.
Well, when we did the research, it was who are the users? What are they using it for? What is their anguish? What are the channel partners? What are they seeing with competitive product? What are they seeing with industry trends? What is it that they want? Typically, they always want lower price points, higher margins, right? The channel partners. So
Consignment
how do you do that?
inventory.
Yes, less inventory. So speaking of less inventory, the product research included global inputs because Moldex has a European presence. They have an international presence, but in particular a European presence. So being able to aggregate all the global requirements into the one product that goes out of the factory, and the only thing that changes is the user instructions in the box, but the platform product, the fundamental platform of the product is the same globally. The cartridges that get attached may be different by market,
right,
and regulatory requirements in those markets, but the fundamental product was global, and that made a huge difference as well.
That makes sense. Does a company have to hire an expert like you, or can they train themselves to conceptualize and imagine and ideate and ask the kinds of questions that are necessary to do the research to visualize the opportunities?
Well, I've been doing this now for over 40 years, and what I typically find is that companies are very good at what they're doing
Right,
in that lane.
right,
Being able to do things like looking in adjacent markets, looking at alternative manufacturing processes. One quick example, I worked with Sunrise Medical, and they were manufacturing bedside commodes for the elderly disabled with metal tubing and bolted on toilet seats, and their product cost was more than what I could at the time, this technology was emerging, buy a plastic patio chair for at retail. And I went to the CEO and I said, hey, imagine for a moment you cut a hole in the middle of a plastic patio chair. Why not?
right.
So $500,000 in R&D and tooling later, and some time,
Right.
we were able to change the world in the way those types of products, and bedside commodes, shower chairs, etc., were made. It just took a lot of outside thinking, technology transfer, R&D, capital investment, both,
But
And
of
we
course,
began shipping all over the globe.
but it's not enough for you to change your thinking about what the product should look like and how to make it. The buyers have to change too.
Well, so in that particular example, the bedside commode, when we did the research, speaking to durable medical equipment dealers, they would rent those products and found their anguish was to clean them. They would
Hmm.
clean them with steam cleaning, and those old metal tubing, screws, nuts, bolts, they all got rusty and nooks and crannies, and that went into the design of the 100% plastic
Interesting.
product, even with the fasteners being plastic snap-in fasteners,
Right.
so that it was super easy to clean. And oh, by the way, just like a patio chair, they stacked and nested
Hmm.
very closely. So instead of maybe 2 in a UPS shippable container, we could get 6.
Wow.
So now the cost per delivered unit went way down,
Right.
and yet they could retail it for almost what they had paid for the metal one, and their margins were much fatter.
Wow. I would imagine that in the course of the research you do, there must be a lot of pie in the sky ideas. How do you strike the balance between open mindedness and creativity with, at the same time, realism about what could actually be manufactured or what somebody might actually buy or
Sure.
what your sales
So,
team could sell?
yes, brainstorming fundamentally is about going wide, looking at all kinds of craziness. One of the first brainstorming sessions I was in at American Hospital Supply, we were trying to do an epidural anesthesia tray in a different way. And one of the leaders of the brainstorming session said, well, let's look at animal analogies. Do animals go digging in places? And we looked at anteaters and, how they go find ants in deep holes, right? So we go crazy, and that's okay. And eventually we look for the kernels of ideas that could be turned into something of value.
Mm-hmm.
And then ultimately through a filtering process, and the company can establish whatever filters are relevant, time to market, retail price points, manufacturing materials and processes, maybe. All of those can be filters applied after we've gone wild.
So similar to kind of the best practices that we may know for typical idea brainstorming, not
Yes.
necessarily product innovation, but idea brainstorming, where you just aggregate ideas whether they sound crazy or not, and then come back and revisit them and apply some filters.
Right. In the initial ideation, there is no bad idea,
Right.
and there is no criticism allowed.
Right. How often is the answer to innovate the manufacturing process versus changing the product per se?
It is often a more difficult challenge. Um, I think about Moldex Metric again with the N95 masks. Their expertise, their claim to fame, their innovation really began when originally the company run by the father had bra cup manufacturing. It would go into bras, swimsuits, all kinds of things where each piece of fabric was cut like a pie shape and stitched together. But they developed a manufacturing process that could take a laminate of fabric and foam and fabric like a sandwich, and under heat and pressure, there's a patent out there of theirs, could create this three-dimensional cup-shaped form. Ultimately, not only did they apply the technology to a bra cup, but they applied it to a face mask. And it revolutionized the way low-cost, high levels of filtration masks could be produced. So it's a much more difficult road to hoe than understanding the anguish in a market that's adjacent to you and finding a strategic partner
Right.
that maybe already has all the capital equipment, manufacturing know-how, and bring that into your channel. But it may be more long-term sustainable, and maybe the margins ultimately will be higher
Mm-hmm.
once the investment, is made. Same thing with the bedside commode. It was $500,000 in tooling and R&D investment initially.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any sense of whether most industrial companies think of a new product as an extension to sell to the same ideal customer profile or a fulcrum to help them lever their way into a new market? Is there any rule of thumb that you've encountered?
My experience is they only stay in their lane historically because they're very good at what they do and they're very busy doing it and they're filling orders. I remember having a very brief conversation with a 100-year-old company that made um, metal mailboxes and school lockers and those kinds of things. And I was talking to them about the possibility of coming in and doing some innovation work. And they're like, nah, we're fine. And I would argue they didn't know what they didn't know. And at the time, they made a decision that that was fine. And that may be fine for their business. But I look at Everest and Jennings at the time, the world's largest manufacturer of wheelchairs, and a small company came out of nowhere making ultralight aluminum first rigid but then foldable wheelchairs that revolutionized the industry. And Everest and Jennings went from the world's largest to an also ran brand acquired by a private equity company and essentially out of business almost 10 years later
Wow.
because they didn't
I
innovate.
interviewed a sales candidate probably 6 or 12 months ago for a role, and this person had been very successful selling lockers to manufacturing facilities and to schools. And the school business had, over the space of a couple of years, essentially disappeared as a lot of the textbooks went onto iPads, and suddenly there
Right.
was much less space needed for students, to keep their stuff stored.
The world can change, and if you're not watching it,
Right.
you will be left behind.
And the recency bias is very hard to overcome. So I guess that
Yes,
argues for bringing in somebody from the outside preemptively, maybe just on a periodic
sure.
basis, saying we're our valuation is good. We're not looking at a transaction. We're filling capacity. We're selling a bunch of stuff. But what should we be thinking about if we were to undertake some exciting new product? Why would we do it? What would drive that decision? What would it look like?
I tend to recommend companies look at what I call the step trends: societal, technological, economic, political. These are all trends. Was working with my students at Pepperdine, and one of the students said, well, there is a political governmental regulation from the Consumer Product Safety Commission about to be implemented where children's cribs can no longer have the drop side rail
Hmm.
because it was strangling children. So now what are we going to do so that parents don't break their back leaning over to get? And they came up with a clever innovation to be within the new regulation and deliver new value to the market. So, yeah, looking at those step trends can be a way of creating new growth through innovation.
So, how much responsibility do the product innovation folks have for helping the product management and marketing to understand how to market and helping the sales teams understand how to sell it? Is there a handoff, or should product innovation be involved, kind of incorporate those from the very beginning of the process and be involved until there's kind of a steady state of consistent sales success?
I like to think of product management and the product development team as two in a box.
Okay.
Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, they got to be hand in hand, arm in arm, whether they're looking at the step trends together, they're looking at a product portfolio together, they're looking at investment strategies together, they're looking at strategic partners for new growth together. And it's not unusual, unfortunately, that many smaller companies, typically under 20 million, they can't afford a product manager. So
Hmm.
they have a marketing manager and they're
Right.
doing everything.
Right.
It's collateral, it's web, it's new products. And that can be a little challenging because new products tend to take a back seat
Right.
in those environments.
Or the founder of the company is kind of the crazy entrepreneur, and all they want to do is introduce new products at a time when sometimes you just need a little more maturity in what you're already doing.
Yes, I've seen that as well. I walked into one company's conference room and there's patents all over the wall.
Right.
And I start inquiring, oh, tell me about that. Yeah, well, we really don't do that anymore. Oh, yeah, well, that one never made it in the market. I
Right.
found that doing the proper prior planning prevents poor financial performance.
Right.
It's not about what any one individual, including the CEO, which can be challenging, wants, but it's about what the market values and is ready to buy quickly. Like
Sure.
the Interlink Electronics Go Speak portable PA, they said, if you had this product, I'd buy it tomorrow.
Right. There are greater and greater demands on boards of directors. They're responsible for a wide variety of things, not only kind of a high level duty of care and some risk management, but really to have in-depth operational insight into cybersecurity and other areas. Is product innovation a skill set that belongs on the board of directors, or can it be brought in on a consulting basis periodically to advise the board?
I've seen it work both ways. Um, if the company has a long-term strategy of growth, there needs to be some representation of product innovation at the board level, at least I would call it the chief executive level. And
Mm-hmm.
let's say if they're a manufacturing company, it's likely they're going to have some type of chief technology officer, a vice president of engineering, chief operating officer. In the corporate settings, I've had a couple times where my boss, if I was the R&D director, would be the chief operating officer,
Okay.
who had responsibility for all of engineering, all of manufacturing, uh, all of that was under his purview. The challenge can be then R&D may get moved over to firefighting for getting product out the door. And I've also worked under the chief marketing officer,
Hmm.
who was slotted with new products, growth from new markets. They usually were a little more visionary, but were struggling with the realities of engineering
Right.
and wanted to often what I call violate the laws of physics,
Right.
and get something out that really couldn't be done in that time frame and were less sensitive. So finding that happy medium spot between, let's say, a CMO and a CTO um, would be a win-win in my perspective.
So it sounds like it belongs more on the executive team than at the board level. The board level is a strategy for growth that they manage the CEO's ability to execute on, then those skill sets belong within the purview of the CEO.
Yes, and occasionally I've seen where there's also a board of advisors on
Mm-hmm.
smaller companies,
Right.
don't have the fiduciary responsibilities, but they're outside eyes. And I've seen those be, and I've acted as with one smaller company, a board of advisor member.
That makes sense. You speak frequently, not only on podcasts, but on stage at various events. And you've got I think more than a dozen kind of standard talks that you delivered. There's a couple that I think merit some conversation. First, you talk about the importance of product innovation ability, not only to just create stuff that the market will buy, but to be able to pitch it to management so that you get support for a project. Is that often a problem? We've got people, very creative people, that come up with ideas and they just have no idea how to actually get their management to buy into it.
Yes. I remember reading a book probably 30 years ago uh, by a guy named Eugene Roudsept, how to develop and sell your new product ideas or something to that effect. And it was fascinating because it wasn't just about engineering, it was about the business side of this portfolio of projects with ROIs.
Mm-hmm.
The doubles, singles, home runs,
Right.
triples, all of those had to become managed in a portfolio. And that really opened my eyes to how to balance it all.
Sure. If this is not part of a company's DNA, it feels like there'd be almost inertia that's impossible to overcome for one person to try to go in and create this kind of a culture. Is it possible, or do you really have to start in a place that embraces the idea of innovation?
It depends on the CEO and maybe the pressure from the board that the CEO is feeling. I did work with this one industrial products company. It was a COVID-related manufactured item, and there was pressure from the board on the CEO for new products. Um, the CEO was fighting fires day to day,
Right.
trying to make some numbers, but realized there needed to be a different culture. And I worked as a fractional R&D director for about a year, trying to change the culture. Fortunately, the culture ended up changing. There were staff changes because there were some, let's just say, belligerent engineers, and that needed to be changed. And there really needed to be a full-time, let's call it a director of engineering, which
Right.
included manufacturing engineering, sustaining engineering, and new product engineering,
So
all under one umbrella.
is that fractional model something that you commonly do?
I have, and I find that to be a win-win. I can bring in all kinds of outside knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
and yet the company doesn't have to pay
Right.
for a full-time R&D director. And if then ultimately there are new products that are generating revenue that's sustainable, like this industrial COVID-related product,
Mm-hmm.
they had new revenue with a number of new products, and then the market changed and sales quadrupled. They had new revenue to be able to afford a full-time person to take over from me. And there
Right.
can be this handoff, which is a good thing.
Sure. Another one of your talks is around licensing. I tend to think of this as kind of an organic growth play. The company comes up with the idea, they build it, they sell it. But you've talked about essentially outsourcing the R&D. In one case, you've talked about maybe developing products that the existing sales team can sell, so you don't have that as a consideration. But you also have raised the possibility of perhaps acquiring technology or acquiring a company that has some products. But the flip side is potentially licensing your development if they don't fit with your portfolio, but they're a source of potential revenue. Talk a little bit about that licensing. How often is that an outcome?
So I'll give you the example going back to all the patents on the wall. Um, it's not unusual to find a technology company that has a lot of intellectual property that's protected with patents, could be domestic, could be global. For whatever reason, they've gone a different way. I can come in and look at what is the IP. How can it be monetized?
Mm-hmm.
Will it be monetized through their own development and ultimately distribution of new products? And is there a path for that?
Right.
Is there a product roadmap to support that or not? And if the company has really shifted into a different category, a different industry, and there's still years left on the intellectual property, then I can take that out and see if there are strategic partners that would want to take it over, maybe just purely acquire, maybe license.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the technology is antiquated and there isn't any value. And that's something that I've been able to look
Or
at
maybe
in
it
the
was a hobby
past.
project that had no kind of rational foundation in industry reality.
I talk about Forbes reported that over 95% of all patents in the United States are never monetized.
Mm-hmm.
And I try to work with my clients to ensure that products are developed that the market would value.
Right. When you're not in clients, you're spending time in courtrooms and you're working as an expert witness. You do, I think, on top of that, you do a lot of STEM education kind of stuff, and obviously, going back to your early days and your entrepreneurial instincts and your early education, you have this excitement around manufacturing that you want to convey and share. So, talk a little bit about that, your commitment to STEM education and how you support it.
Sure. I just got in the mail this week an email. My next round of students from USC, the University of Southern California, they're now matching mentors. to students. I work with the entrepreneur program over at USC. I'm an entrepreneur in residence at the California State University of Northridge. I live in that area, and I coach students there. I do judge work in the entrepreneurship program over there. I've done guest lectures over there. I've done some guest lectures in some continuing education high schools, students that are looking to maybe go into entrepreneurship, start their own businesses, maybe not necessarily go on to college. I enjoy that. I appreciate being able to work with these young, exciting minds that want to grow, that want to create, that want to be successful, and just don't have the path and the experience and perhaps some wisdom that can focus them and do it maybe a little more efficiently.
So I assume that's more a hobby for you rather than a professional pursuit.
I looked at more professional pursuits. I did some online teaching through Rice University, and in the end, I realized that academia has its own bureaucratic challenges,
Right.
As well as lack of financial opportunities. And I enjoy doing it where it's not important in terms of revenue stream, or not going to pull me into the bureaucracy
Right.
that can exist in academia.
So you get a charge out of helping students kind of picture a future and appreciate the excitement of working on some of these kinds of things. What else do you do to burn off pressure and stress?
A wide variety, everything from gardening to enjoying the Southern California weather when it's not full of fires. That keeps me busy.
Back to your expert witness work for a minute. I think you really focus on two angles. One is product liability, and the other is infringement of intellectual property. Is most of your work preempting problems in the design phase, or is it later on on either the defense or plaintiff side once a product is in the market and there's a problem that arises?
Well, let me go back for a moment to something you said. I actually work with three types of litigators.
Okay.
I do product liability work, which is a bulk of the work that I do. The patent infringement you mentioned, but also one of my larger cases last year was a commercial dispute between an N95 mask manufacturer and an N95 distributor.
Okay.
And distributors counsel retained me to address issues of product quality, expectations, and so forth. In terms of the work that I do, I did have a conversation with one manufacturer who made swimming pool products.
Okay.
And he wanted me to do a preemptive review. And we had some preliminary discussions, and then I don't know if it was the board, somebody made some decisions. Well, no, we're fine. So most of my work has been injury related.
Got it.
Where unfortunately there was some type of a problem already,
Right.
and I was brought in. But on the patent infringement case, for example, the attorney that brought me in had a client who was being sued, and I was able to, myself and a colleague that I brought in, demonstrate that particular manufacturer, industrial products manufacturer, was not infringing. And we were able to do a tear down of competitive product, of some other things, and show it was not infringing. So it's a wide variety, but mostly on the expert witness side, it's after the fact, but I have been trying to promote to small to mid-sized manufacturers to have me do a preemptive review.
And do most of the cases that you're working on settle, or do you end up testifying frequently?
Most settle, but I've done a number of depositions. The 3M earplug case, that was the largest multi-district litigation case in U.S. history. That was a 10-hour day, a 7-hour depo. And I've been up against Clorox, up against Honeywell. Long depots. Most overall settle, but there's been some trial as well as the depositions.
Got it. It feels to me like we're at the cusp of an exciting era in American manufacturing. There's kind of this confluence of maybe we say national spirit and reshoring and supply chain maturing and AI and national security awareness and other factors all coming together. Do you sense also an inertia in American manufacturing?
Sure. So it was about a year ago, I started doing some talks on reshoring. And there was one particular Southern California manufacturer I worked with. I helped him bring back a number of production tools from Asia to the US and did the financial analysis to show that we did the digging in China in particular and found the Chinese had automated manufacturing and the incremental cost on the cost sheet to bring it back to the US was maybe a few percent, maybe as much as I think certain conditions like 10% more, but it didn't address all the soft costs.
Right.
So in that particular project, I was able to show that sales responsiveness, where there wasn't a 6 to 8 week lead time, it was a 6 to 8 day lead time,
Right.
Based upon US manufacturing, product quality, minimum order quantity significantly reduced,
Right.
warehouse and inventory carrying costs, which weren't in the cost sheet, was significantly reduced. So the net was bring it home. We did, and we have, in that particular project, it was a real success. All of those soft attributes had not been on the cost sheet.
Really. So with all these factors coming together, if there is this energy or this inertia, should that change the way companies approach innovation? Should it accelerate their innovation? Should it slow it down while they concentrate on reshoring and other kinds of things? Is there a rule of thumb that you would suggest?
Sure. So in terms of rule of thumb, when there is a high labor content, and I have a whole talk on this, by the way, there's a high labor content, and the item can nest well. It has a shipping density, I call it.
Right.
It makes sense sometimes to keep it in China, in Asia, wherever. There may be, on the other hand, think of a cat scratcher. It's a large, bulky, low-value item. Maybe it needs to stay in the U.S. or maybe go near shore to Mexico or some combination thereof. In the dental industry, some dental equipment for intellectual property protection. We decided to have molded items come from one supplier in Asia, circuit boards come from another, and they were assembled in a Southern California facility where no one supplier had the whole keys to the cabinet.
Right.
And that's another way to do it. So there's no absolute. It's always on a case-by-case basis.
I guess it feels like if there is this growing energy and growing excitement, that there's likely to be more innovation. And for a company who hesitates to innovate, that could put them at a competitive disadvantage, I would think.
Yeah, and I would say if you've done the homework to determine that you could produce the item in the United States, then you will likely design it differently from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
I remember one project at Mattel. I was working on this toy where we were very clever in keeping the labor out, which opened up the opportunity to put it in the Mexican facility rather than in Asia. And in the end, there was some corporate edict that it was going to Asia, and the Asian manufacturer said, "Oh, no, that's too tricky of tooling.
Mm-hmm.
That won't be reliable. Just make those parts into separate multiple pieces that we need to have labor to put them together, and we'll screw them together." And I was like, "Really?" And they said, "Oh yeah, we can handle that with lots more people on the factory line." And I was like, "Okay." And so that's what they ended up doing. But if you know where you really want to put the manufacturing and you can run some preliminary analyses to see that, then you likely will design it differently.
So talking about trends, you spoke earlier about the acronym that you use to guide the analysis of trends. Certainly there's labor and talent challenges right now. There's a silver tsunami. Are there others that you've identified that are really kind of impinging or impacting business immediately in the short term that you think are factors to consider in innovation?
Well, let's come back to this reshoring. I'm scheduled to do another reshoring talk in around April because at the moment we don't know what the regulations are going to be.
Right.
And I think that's going to drive a lot of innovation. Is it going to be there's some compelling value in being able to manufacture domestically? And what does that mean to the product roadmap?
Certainly another big trend is AI. And I can envision two uses. One is to use AI to guide and inform the research and the needs analysis and the product innovation and the infringement and liability research and the manufacturing process innovation, all of that stuff, to help augment the experience the companies have in those steps leading up to it. But the other is to incorporate AI into new versions of products. Do you think one is going to be more important than the other going forward?
I think it's still too early to tell. I've done a little research with AI in manufacturing, optimization of manufacturing equipment, particularly as it comes to preventative maintenance, and knowing that it isn't just a number of counts that, let's say, a punch press punched.
Right.
There's really different measures that can be automated. The current draw on the motor can be looked at real time, and then with AI smarts predict what's really going on in the machine.
Right.
Maybe you were punching thicker material more than you used to punch. So all of that is going to happen. In terms of product innovation, when that happens, how that happens, it's a little unknown. There may be some dovetail with the Internet of Things, the IoT, and how you can take the IoT data, feed it through an AI program, the language models,
Right.
and be able to predict what that might mean for a human interface with a product.
Right.
Still too early to tell in my mind.
Are there other implications of AI that you think I'm missing that will impact innovation?
I think I could see where this trends analysis, back to your earlier point, looking at these trends, being able to feed data into the model, such as government regulations, back to the juvenile products, the crib, baby crib.
Right.
What does it mean? Who are the players in the market? What's the technology in the market? Where should it go? How could it go? Maybe even, is there technology in other markets where you could transfer
Right.
the technology in? And, I've done work with ChatGPT, trying to understand what it can and can't do, what it outputs, how does it output, starting to look at the subject of prompt engineering, how to write a good prompt. We're very early on in that. I think another few years for sure before we're getting some value.
We originally met through our mutual friend, Lisa Spatafor-Thompson, who was actually a guest on the Industrial Growth Institute podcast back in episode 15. She is a strategic pricing expert, and that makes me wonder about how pricing fits into your work. You've spoken a lot about costing, but do you start out to design new versions to hit different price points, or does good innovation unlock different higher margin pricing models? How does this bump up against pricing?
Yeah, the answer is D, all the above.
Okay.
At Mattel Toys, there was a roadmap. Target would have certain products on their planogram. They knew exactly what was going on the shelf, where, with what price points. And we knew a $9.99 retail would have $2 to $2.50 in manufacturing cost. Where a medical device that has to have certain functions, it may not prioritize pricing quite the same way.
Right.
It has to deliver safe and effective functionality. But there's certainly some influence of product pricing there. Every project is unique. An industrial product pricing may be a little less sensitive than a $9.99 retail toy. Or in
But
some
obviously,
cases, go ahead.
increasingly, the business model innovation and the recurring revenue components of pricing are an aspirational goal of many companies. And
Yes,
so the innovation has to tie in with the pricing model and that goal of increasing recurring revenue.
yes. Well, if possible, it
True.
doesn't always work that way. Certain industrial products, I think of a half mask, or even the full face respirators, they have long life in market.
Hmm.
Um, it's hard to envision a service model there
Right.
or some other ancillary revenue stream there, except for the cartridges themselves,
Sure.
which are disposable essentially.
Obviously, you've got a lot of videos and articles. Those are a great resource of information around this. Where else do you recommend folks turn for inspiration around product innovation? Are there books or podcasts or YouTube channels or places that you find are really impactful?
There are a number of podcasts. I can't think of any off the top of my head that I can share, but they're available out there. There are a number of classic books out there, but again, you can search online for that content. I just like to look in ancillary markets.
Hmm.
I look at things that don't necessarily fit that box, and say, what does that mean to what I'm working on?
Right.
I'll give you one quick example. At one point, we were doing some research. I can't remember where this was on face seals. And somebody said, well, how does a gecko hold onto a wall? Who would have ever thought to look for a new product,
Right.
with this, what's called biomimicry, right? But you just never know.
Right. Yeah, I think the intersections and adjacencies are where there's a lot of intellectual stimulation and excitement and business opportunity and you're describing innovation opportunity. How do
Yes.
folks connect with you to learn more?
Sure. You can Google me at Eric Paul Rose. You can find me on LinkedIn under the same. My website is pinnaclepi.com, pinnaclepi.com. Easy enough.
I'll drop that link in the show notes as well.
Great.
This has been a fascinating conversation, Eric. So
My
now,
pleasure. So glad to be here.
all right, well, now's the hard part, the real challenge for you. You need to wrap us up. You need to give us, say, 3 minutes that distill the product innovation challenge and opportunity for middle market industrial manufacturers.
Well, I think first and foremost is look outside the box. If you really want to grow, rather than at maybe 1 or 2% a year, you want to have some type of a hockey stick growth, you have to look outside the box. And if you don't have resources to look outside the box within your organization, then certainly look outside the organization. It may be in market research, it may be in product development, it may be in strategic partnerships. Look outside the box. When doing product innovation work, look at what I call the three legs of the stool. You need requirements first, then design, then test, and test and requirements must reconcile before you launch so that you don't get in trouble post-launch. And then lastly, I would leave you with my article that I had published on the cover of the Product Development and Management Association Journal a number of years ago. There are 5 critical attributes of a new product. It's the schedule, the feature set, the product cost, capital equipment cost, and engineering cost. Manage all those, and you should be successful in developing new products.
Famous last words, manage all those and you should be successful. All right, great finish. Thank you for your time. Thanks for sharing your insights and your thoughts with the entire Industrial Growth Institute community. I'm pretty sure that everyone listening knows someone who would value Eric's insights from this conversation. Please give the episode a like and comment to help others find it, and be sure to share it with anyone who you think will thank you for doing so. Thanks so much for joining me, Eric, for this episode of the Industrial Growth Institute podcast.
My pleasure. So much. I appreciate so much being here, Ed.